whispers in the ruins. They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when an entire chapter of human history is whispered over, blurred at the edges, or erased with silence? Tonight, let me take you back to the moment the lights dimmed on the ancient world, and a strange hush fell over Europe. It wasn't a scream, not the kind that echoes after the fall of empires. It was more like the slow fading of a candle. The kind of quiet that slips in after the last voice has stopped singing and the last page has been turned. Rome had fallen, or at least, that's how the story often begins. Grand cities that once hummed with life, with marble forums and aqueducts cutting across valleys, now stood broken and choked with weeds. Roads, once straight and purposeful, turned to mud and disrepair. Where once there were senators and sculptors, poets and philosophers, now there were fields gone to seed, cold hearths, and names no one remembered anymore. But that's only the surface. The term, Dark Ages, conjures images of ignorance and fire, of barbarians at the gates, of monks huddled in stone rooms copying old texts by candlelight. It makes you think of a world that forgot how to dream. 1,000 years where nothing new was made, nothing beautiful sung, and nothing of value written. But what if that's not the truth? What if the Dark Ages were never dark at all, but deliberately dimmed? As the Roman Empire crumbled in the West, a power vacuum yawned across Europe. The mighty legions, once the backbone of civilization, had either melted away or been recalled to defend the heartlands. Out in the provinces, Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, people were left to fend for themselves. Villas were abandoned. Statues toppled. Taxes went uncollected. But people didn't vanish. They adapted. They changed. In Britain, for example, when the last Roman officials packed up and left, they didn't leave behind a wasteland. Archaeology tells a different story, of Roman villas repurposed, of local rulers emerging with new hybrid customs, of Celtic tribes absorbing Roman ways while holding tight to their own. It wasn't a death. It was a transformation. But those in power, later powers, had little interest in telling that kind of story. Centuries later, as Renaissance thinkers in Florence and Rome dusted off the works of Cicero and Aristotle, they looked back at the time between them and antiquity with a mix of pity and pride. They saw their own age as a rebirth, a sudden awakening after a long, troubled sleep. And to do that, they needed the years in between to look like a nightmare. So they called it dark. But that label, Dark Ages, wasn't used by the people who lived through it. They had no idea they were in the middle of what future scholars would call a historical void. They were building churches, crafting jewelry, preserving texts, making laws, and singing songs. They weren't in the dark. They were alive. Take the Irish monks, for instance. As Europe fractured and trade routes collapsed, monasteries in the misty hills of Ireland became lighthouses. They copied manuscripts, pagan, Christian, scientific, and poetic. By hand. Line by line. Illuminated with strange creatures, vines, and intricate designs that no Roman would recognize. And they didn't just hoard knowledge, they sent it out again. They traveled to Scotland, to the Frankish realms, to Italy, bringing books, new alphabets, and ideas. Or consider the Visigoths in Spain, who didn't just sack Rome and vanish. They settled, built a kingdom, passed laws that protected women's rights and codified legal traditions centuries before some modern countries would. Their kings held councils that debated theology, philosophy, and governance. Hardly the work of illiterate savages. But the most chilling thing isn't what we forgot, it's what we were told to forget. When Charlemagne rose in the 8th century, crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope himself, he needed a story. He needed a beginning. So what better way to elevate his empire than to claim he had resurrected civilization from chaos? A new Rome, born from fire and shadow. And to make that claim stick, the years before him had to be seen as lost. It worked. For generations, history textbooks echoed the same tale. Rome fell, and darkness followed. Only when men like Charlemagne appeared did the dawn return. But this was no accident. This was narrative, shaped by politics, religion, and power. And yet there are cracks in the tale. Pieces that don't fit. Like the court of Alcuin of York, an English scholar who taught Charlemagne's children and helped launch a revival in learning across Europe. His work preserved Latin grammar, classic literature, and helped standardize the way we write. But Alcuin didn't see himself as a rebuilder of a fallen world. He saw continuity. He quoted Augustine, referenced ancient poets, taught logic and astronomy. His world wasn't made of ashes, it was made of memory. All across Europe, cities never fully died. Rome still had a population, even if reduced. Constantinople in the east glittered with mosaics and domes, its scholars debating medicine and ethics. In Moorish Spain, cities like Córdoba boasted libraries with hundreds of thousands of volumes, at a time when most of Christian Europe had barely begun to rebuild theirs. The so-called darkness was never universal. It was uneven, messy, complex, like all human history. But that complexity was swept aside. The myth of the Dark Ages was simpler, easier to teach, easier to frame. And in doing so, we lost the stories of poets in monasteries, of metalworkers forging intricate designs, of queens who governed, of farmers who whispered the old Roman calendars while planting their crops. Tonight, that silence begins to lift. The ruins speak again. Not with the voices of conquerors or kings, but with the quiet truths of forgotten hands. Those who built in the shadows, who remembered when others forgot, who held the flame just long enough to pass it on. And that, perhaps, is the greatest cover-up of all, not that the world forgot how to learn, but that we were told it had. The lost cities that never died. Somewhere in the damp mists of a Frankish forest, the moss creeps up the stones of what once was a Roman villa. Ivy threads its way through broken archways. Owls roost where lords once dined. It looks like a ruin, silent, forgotten. But listen more closely. Just beyond the crumbled gate, someone is tilling the earth. A child runs barefoot along the old courtyard. Smoke rises from a hearth, not far from where a mosaic once shimmered in the light of empire. This was the secret of the so-called Dark Ages. The cities weren't dead, they were dreaming. Many were never truly abandoned, only transformed. The idea that civilization vanished overnight is a story convenient for conquerors, not for archaeologists. Dig below the surface, and you'll find continuity hiding beneath collapse. Coins still minted. Wells still used. Temples turned into churches. Even in Rome, where the forums lay in decay, people still lived among the ruins. They walked past the broken columns every day, hauling water and firewood, whispering prayers in Latin that was slowly changing into something new. Take Naples, a city that stretched back to the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then into the unknown. While Northern Europe struggled, Naples retained its libraries. In its shadowed corners, Roman law was still taught. Plays were performed in half-crumbling theaters. It wasn't the grandeur of empire, but it was something stranger, an echo that refused to die. Then there's Ravenna. Not far from the Adriatic, hidden like a jewel behind marshes and pines. Ravenna was never just a city, it was a mosaic in stone. Long after Rome had fallen, Ravenna thrived as the seat of emperors and kings. Its churches, layered with gold and glass, still shimmer in candlelight today, telling stories not of darkness, but of resilience. And in Constantinople, the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, the light never even flickered. While Western Europe was still reeling, the Byzantines built domes that touched the heavens. In the Hagia Sophia, choruses echoed beneath a canopy of stars painted in gold. Its libraries held texts that would later spark the minds of Italian humanists. Its engineers designed machines for defense and comfort. Its hospitals practiced surgery, its scholars debated science. So why, then, was this world buried? Because it didn't fit the myth. The people of these cities, Byzantines, Goths, Moors, did not speak the right languages. They weren't ruled by popes. They followed different customs, sometimes different gods. And so, when the chroniclers of later centuries wrote their tales, they passed over these places like shadows in the corner of a candlelit room. Not quite forgotten. Not quite remembered. But even in the forgotten places, life clung tight. In the ruins of Trier, one of the oldest Roman cities north of the Alps, people rebuilt their lives stone by stone. They quarried temples to build homes, carved graves into the remains of bathhouses, turned basilicas into cathedrals. It wasn't vandalism, it was survival. They were taking what remained and forging something new. Beneath modern Paris lie layers of this hidden world. Roman Lutetia with its baths and aqueducts gave way to medieval alleys and wooden bridges. Yet under the cobbled streets, foundations remain. Sometimes, when a metro line is dug or a cellar renovated, bones rise up from forgotten graves, still clutching fragments of jewelry or rusted keys. They weren't the remains of savages. They were artisans, traders, mothers, scribes. People who never heard the term Dark Ages, and would not have recognized it if they had. Their days were measured in bread and sunlight, births and winters, saints' feasts and market days. If darkness had crept in, it was not everywhere, nor all at once. Much of this mystery lies in the silence of writing. The centuries following Rome's fall saw fewer grand inscriptions, fewer scrolls. That's true. But that doesn't mean people stopped thinking, feeling, dreaming. It means that parchment was scarce. That ink was precious. That survival took precedence over grandeur. You can lose a library in a fire. You can lose 100 stories to the damp in a monastery's cellar. But it doesn't mean they were never told. And some stories survived, hidden in unexpected places. In Iceland, generations later, skalds would sing of Odin and the worlds before time. But they also preserved strange echoes of older truths, of migrations, of vanished kingdoms. In the Arab world, scholars translated and preserved Greek and Roman texts, adding their own insights in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. When those texts later made their way back to Europe, they weren't returning from nowhere. They had been kept safe across deserts and in libraries lit by oil lamps under the crescent moon. Even in the cold, damp corners of Northumbria, monks penned chronicles. The Venerable Bede, a man born in the 7th century, wrote of plagues, of kings and stars, of eclipses and faith. His was not a voice in the dark. It was the voice of a man standing in twilight, looking toward dawn. Still, the idea persisted, that there had been a fall, and a silence, and only then a rebirth. But what if the world never stopped turning? What if the stars still wheeled over cities that history had tried to forget? Tonight, picture one of those cities. Maybe it's Lyon, maybe Cologne. Maybe it's one that no longer has a name. There's a stone wall with ivy hanging over it, a fountain still trickling from a forgotten aqueduct. A child chases a dog through an alley where senators once strolled. A bell rings from a chapel built on the bones of a Roman bathhouse. It is neither ancient nor modern. It is something in between. Something we were never meant to see. But it was real. And it was never dark. The silent architects of memory. There's something oddly comforting about candlelight. It doesn't blind. It doesn't roar. It simply glows, flickering softly in the dark, holding back the void with quiet dignity. That's how memory survived in the so-called Dark Ages. Not as a blaze of glory, but as small lights tended by forgotten hands. Most stories from this era don't begin with kings or warriors. They begin in places no bigger than a stable, or a windswept chapel perched on a cliff, or a damp stone room where a man dips a feather into ink and breathes heavily as he writes. There, in those forgotten corners, something astonishing was happening. History was being copied, protected, smuggled through the centuries, word by word. These were the silent architects of memory, the monks, scribes, and scholars who refused to let the world forget itself. Far from the noise of empires, monasteries became islands of thought. Not all were grand. Some were built with wood and thatch. Others clung to rocky hillsides, lashed by wind and rain. But inside, the minds at work were anything but primitive. They spoke Latin. They understood geometry. They debated eternity, and the weight of sin, and the turning of the heavens. In places like Lindisfarne, Iona, and Kells, monks toiled by candlelight to copy not just the Bible, but Aristotle, Virgil, even fragments of long-dead mathematicians. Their ink was ground from oak galls and iron salts. Their parchment, scraped from animal skins, was worth more than silver. To make a single book could take a year. But they did it anyway. Because they believed knowledge was sacred. And they were right. These weren't mindless copyists. Many left behind comments in the margins. Jokes even. Complaints about the cold. Notes about bad ink. One scribe in Ireland added a line that simply read, "Oh, my hand!" That small sight traveled across 1,000 years. A whisper from one human to another, long after both the book and the name had been forgotten. And it wasn't just men. In convents across Europe, nuns also preserved the past. They created illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf and lapis blue, inscribed prayers, and taught girls to read. In a time when silence was often mistaken for absence, their work speaks volumes. But the scriptoria, the writing rooms, weren't the only places where memory lived. Elsewhere, in village squares and forest clearings, oral traditions blossomed. People told stories to survive the winters. Myths tangled with history. Legends of Arthur, of Charlemagne, of lost kingdoms beneath the sea. These weren't just tales to pass the time. They were scaffolding for identity. They reminded people who they were, and where they came from. And memory wasn't confined to parchment or song. It lived in stone, too. Churches began to rise, sometimes atop the ruins of old temples. They weren't the soaring cathedrals of later centuries, but squat, heavy places, built with rough stone, soaked in incense and mystery. Their walls bore strange carvings, twisted beasts, saints with haunting eyes, suns and stars. Some were Christian. Others hinted at older faiths, half-remembered. Inside, priests preached in Latin, while the people muttered prayers in tongues that had evolved from Roman speech. Languages were being born. French, Spanish, Italian, none existed yet. But you could hear their heartbeat in the way people spoke, blending old empire with local rhythm. In these centuries, Europe wasn't a wasteland. It was a crucible. Something was forming, reshaping. Cultures collided. Ideas migrated. And all of it hidden behind the veil of darkness. It was easy for later historians to overlook this because the changes weren't flashy. They didn't happen in palaces. They happened in the way people plowed their fields, or brewed their ale, or whispered lullabies that sounded just a little different from their grandparents. And so, by the time the Renaissance dawned, the world it awoke to wasn't empty. It was a world that had been dreaming in slow, patient movements. Not backward but inward. Like the deep breaths before spring. Like the stillness before the thaw. The myth of the Dark Ages told us that nothing of value happened between the fall of Rome and the rise of Florence. But the truth is far more beautiful. And far more human. People fell in love. Composed music. Carved wooden toys for their children. Built bridges. Studied stars. Laughed around fires. Carried water from wells that had served their great-grandparents. They weren't ghosts waiting for modernity to find them. They were us. Different only in clothing and calendar. And though they spoke in languages we no longer understand, their voices are still here. In the manuscripts that lie in museums. In the cathedrals whose stones echo with ancient footsteps. In the words we speak today, shaped by 1,000 nameless tongues. Somewhere tonight, a manuscript lies open on a shelf, its gold leaf dulled by time. Its pages smell of dust and age. But if you look closely, you might see a thumbprint in the corner, left by someone 1,000 years ago who turned the page and paused. A flicker of life. A light in the dark. The truth is, there were always lights. Always people who remembered. We just stopped looking. But now the veil lifts, and the story begins to unfold again. The day the libraries burned. Imagine, just for a moment, that your entire world fits inside a single room. A place lined with scrolls, with text copied lovingly by candlelight, where the air smells of wax and dust and ink. A library, not vast, but sacred. A chamber of memory, where the thoughts of ancients still hum beneath the silence. Now imagine the door bursting open. Boots on stone. Fire licking the edges of parchment. A hand gripping a torch with no idea what's about to be lost. That was the quiet tragedy behind the myth of the Dark Ages. It wasn't that people stopped writing. It was that the things they wrote vanished. Across centuries, libraries were not just neglected, they were deliberately destroyed. Some burned in wars. Others were purged by kings, by bishops, by men who believed only one truth could be written. And sometimes, they were simply forgotten. The roofs caved in. The walls rotted. Rain and rats did what fire could not. But it began long before Europe lost Rome. In Alexandria, the ancient world's greatest library had once held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, texts in Greek, Latin, Egyptian, Hebrew. Some say they held the secrets of lost civilizations. Others believe they included plays, poems, and philosophies now gone forever. But that library did not disappear in a single night. It died slowly, over centuries. Piece by piece. War by war. Rule by rule. By the time medieval monks were preserving knowledge in their scriptoria, the ashes of Alexandria were already cold. And so, when the so-called Dark Ages began, Europe wasn't starting from scratch. It was starting from memory, fragmented, scattered, whispered between pages. What we lost wasn't just facts. It was imagination. One scribe in the 9th century copied down a passage from a Roman agricultural text. The page was worn, the margins torn, but it spoke of grafting fruit trees, of planting by moonlight, of methods passed down from farmer to farmer over centuries. The scribe added a small comment beneath it. It is said this no longer works. A quiet line. A voice on the edge of forgetting. And yet those fragments mattered. Because for every book that was lost, there were others that survived, barely. The works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Euclid did not stay in Europe. They traveled east, to the scholars of the Islamic world. In Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, libraries flourished while Europe slept. Muslim scholars didn't just preserve ancient texts, they expanded them. They challenged them. They translated them into Arabic and added their own insights. Algebra, astronomy, medicine. They didn't invent civilization, they saved it. And centuries later, those texts would make their way back west. Through Spain, through Sicily, through crusaders and merchants and wandering monks. But by then, something strange had happened. The men receiving them believed they were receiving a miracle. They didn't know they were receiving a return. It wasn't a new dawn. It was memory, finding its way home. But even within Europe, all had not been lost. In places like Monte Cassino, deep in the mountains of Italy, monks kept copying. Not because they sought fame or knowledge, but because they believed writing itself was a form of prayer. They copied Bibles. They copied histories. Sometimes they copied Roman cookbooks, with recipes for sauces no one had tasted in 500 years. It was all sacred. And then there were the libraries that didn't burn, but vanished anyway. Sometimes, a monastery would fall into ruin. Invaders would come. A storm would strike. And the books would be buried beneath rubble. Forgotten. For centuries. Then one day, a farmer plowing a field might strike a stone. Dig down. Find a chamber. And inside, a single book, damp and curled, but alive. That's how we've rediscovered some of the greatest texts of antiquity. Not in palaces, but in pigsties, under floorboards, inside walls. They were never meant to survive. But they did. Because the truth is, history has its own stubborn will. It does not always obey kings. It slips through cracks, hides in corners, waits beneath dust for someone to look. And now, slowly, we begin to see what was almost lost. Poems written by women in cloistered abbeys, their words aching with loneliness and wonder. Letters between scholars discussing the weight of planets. Hymns that hint at older, pagan songs. Instructions for building machines that would not exist again for centuries. All of it hidden in plain sight. So the next time you hear that the Dark Ages were a time of ignorance, remember this. The problem wasn't that people forgot. The problem was that their memory was taken, burned, banned, buried. And yet, even as the fires rose, somewhere in a distant cloister, a lone hand dipped a quill in ink and kept writing. Because someone had to remember. And because memory, real memory, is harder to kill than any empire. When the heavens went silent, long before cathedrals scraped the skies, people looked upward in wonder. The stars, constant and ancient, were not just lights. They were signs, omens, clocks, gods. Every village, every farmstead, every crumbling Roman outpost in the early medieval world had someone who could read the sky. But then, the heavens seemed to go quiet. In the centuries after Rome's fall, many of the old calendars fell out of sync. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But enough. Festivals shifted. The rhythm of planting and harvest frayed. The stars still shone, but the old knowledge, the exact alignments, the rituals tied to solstices, the constellations that once told stories, began to fade. Not because the people stopped believing, but because the storytellers were gone. The druids who once charted lunar eclipses from stone circles had vanished. The Roman augurs, who recorded celestial events in official journals, had been replaced by priests of a new faith who sometimes looked at the stars with suspicion. To control the soul, they needed to master time. So new calendars were written, new feasts marked. Old solstices were given new names, Christmas for Saturnalia, Easter for the spring rites of rebirth. But beneath the new layers, something older still pulsed. Even in remote churches, you'd find carvings of the sun and moon tucked among saints. In old peasant songs, you'd hear echoes of celestial myths, long after their meaning had been forgotten. And sometimes, the sky didn't just fade into the background. Sometimes it struck fear. One winter in the early 6th century, across Europe and parts of Asia, the sun dimmed. For over a year, it gave little heat. Crops failed. Snow fell in summer. Chronicles speak of a strange haze, a gray world, a sun that rose and cast no shadow. People believed the end had come. They were not entirely wrong. We now know that sometime around 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in Iceland, or far to the east, threw ash high into the atmosphere. A global veil of dust. A cold sun. And in the chaos that followed, kingdoms weakened. Plagues moved in. Famines emptied villages. And in the silence that followed, the sky seemed less like a source of knowledge, and more like a threat. Yet even then, people looked up. In monasteries, monks began tracking the moon for their calendars. In the Islamic world, astronomers mapped the heavens with breathtaking precision, giving names to stars that we still use today. In China, astronomers recorded supernovae and comets, noting them with careful dates while dynasties rose and fell. And even in dark corners of post-Roman Europe, some lights flickered on. In Ireland, monks used ancient methods to track Easter's ever-shifting date. They studied the cycles of the moon. They preserved diagrams, spirals, crosses, solar patterns, woven into illuminated manuscripts that glittered with mathematical insight. To them, the heavens had not gone silent. They had simply changed languages. But what of the ordinary folk? To them, the night sky was still alive with meaning. They told stories of stars that moved, wanderers, which we now call planets. They feared comets as messengers of death. They marked the return of certain constellations with seasonal festivals. These weren't scientific charts. They were living maps, constellations passed down like heirlooms, stitched into memory, not parchment. And still, the silence lingered. Because much of this knowledge was never written down. When a wise woman in a village told a child that the crescent moon meant good luck for travel, no one copied her words onto vellum. When an old man showed his grandson how to plant by starlight, no monk stood nearby with a pen. These were the quiet astronomers, the nameless astrologers, the dreamers who kept the sky alive even as the official records dimmed. And they are gone now. Their words lost. But their eyes once traced the same constellations we see tonight. That's the cruel trick of calling it dark. Because the sky was always there. The stars always shone. It was us who stopped listening. Or maybe, it was us who were taught not to. Because to question the heavens meant to challenge authority. And in a world where kings ruled by divine right, where bishops set calendars and carved time into sacred hours, there was danger in asking too much of the stars. So the silence wasn't always ignorance. Sometimes it was fear. But still, in margins and manuscripts, small hands kept drawing stars. A child's doodle of a crescent moon next to a psalm. A monk's record of an eclipse. A traveler's tale of lights in the northern sky. Fragments. Threads. Enough to remind us that wonder never dies. It just hides. And sometimes that wonder, once so vast and fearless, was compressed into a lullaby, hummed to a baby in the dead of winter. A song that said, "Don't be afraid of the dark. The stars are still up there. Watching. Waiting." Not everything was lost. Some things were simply sleeping. The kingdom's time forgot. There are names buried beneath the pages of history books, kingdoms that once ruled vast stretches of land, minted their own coins, wrote their own laws, and told stories around their own hearths. And yet, when you speak of the early medieval world today, most people can only recall Rome, and then a silence. But that silence wasn't empty. It was filled with voices. Rulers, poets, farmers, lovers. People who belonged to forgotten realms. The problem wasn't that these kingdoms didn't matter. It's that someone decided they didn't. One of these nearly forgotten worlds was the kingdom of the Lombards. They swept down from the north and carved a realm into the body of Old Italy. Fierce at first, they became administrators, lawmakers, and builders. They blended Roman law with Germanic tradition. They wrote codes that protected land, punished theft, and even addressed women's rights. And they did it all in a land the world assumed had fallen into ruin. But the Lombards didn't vanish. They were simply overwritten. When Charlemagne's armies arrived, he didn't just conquer. He erased. Monasteries retold stories with the Franks as saviors. The Lombard kings became villains or footnotes. And the dust began to settle over their memory. Elsewhere, in the shadowy woods of Eastern Europe, the Avars raised their own empires. In the north, the Picts painted themselves in dyes and symbols and vanished into legend. The kingdom of Alt-Clut stood proud on the river Clyde, its stone fortress watching over misty hills. And in Iberia, before the Moors, before even the unified Visigoths, smaller realms thrived, blending Celt, Roman, and local spirit into something entirely unique. But they left few cathedrals, few stone monuments. They didn't write their history in Latin. And so, they disappeared, not from the land, but from the official memory of Europe. Even the great Merovingians, those early Frankish kings with their long hair and blood-soaked thrones, were reduced by later writers to little more than puppets. In truth, they ruled with intricate legal codes, built alliances with the church, and expanded learning. But their story was told by those who came after, and who wanted their own light to shine brighter. You see, history isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes, it's written by the survivors who need to simplify the past to explain the present. That's how kingdoms are forgotten. Not in battle, not in fire, but in ink. And yet, traces remain. Coins found buried beneath the roots of ancient trees, stamped with strange names and crowned figures no one remembers. Brooches worn by queens whose lineages are unknown. Law codes etched into brittle manuscripts, written in languages that no longer exist. Even more curiously, we find stories. A folk tale told in the hills of Wales about a warrior woman with hair like fire. A carved stone in the Scottish Highlands showing a beast with a snout like a dolphin and the legs of a lion. A lullaby in the forests of Lithuania, humming with rhythm that predates modern tongues. They are remnants of vanished realms. Ghosts of states and nations that once held their heads high beneath the same sky we now ignore. But these kingdoms did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they didn't fit the new story. Because when Europe began to stitch itself back together, it needed a beginning, a clean one. It needed Rome, then Charlemagne, then the birth of Christendom. There was no room for 100 tangled tribes and cultures. So the messiness was smoothed over. The unknown ignored. The wild edges clipped clean. But in truth, those edges were everything. They were the texture of early medieval life. The way cultures collided and blended. The way Latin mixed with Germanic tongues to create French. The way Roman building techniques fused with Celtic patterns. The way forgotten kings named their sons after both Thor and St. Peter. The forgotten kingdoms were not detours. They were the path. They were the soil from which modern Europe grew, roots twisted, deep, and hidden beneath layers of official history. And though their names have faded, their fingerprints remain. In place names, in dialects, in the rhythms of old songs and the shape of borderlines. So the next time you look at a map of Europe, imagine what's not written there. The kingdoms that ruled before countries had names. The realms that vanished not in defeat, but in silence. And the people who once stood on castle walls that no longer exist, watching the stars with the same sense of longing we feel now. Their memory was never truly lost. It just took longer to find its voice. The monks who guarded the flame. The world outside was often brutal. Cold winds, raids from unknown lands, the ever-looming threat of hunger. And yet, in pockets of stone and silence, there were places where the world stood still. Places where time didn't rush, where the voices of the ancients still whispered through vellum pages. These were the monasteries. Not grand, not in those early centuries. Many were little more than huts clustered around a chapel. Roofs made of wood and rush. Walls of stone, patched with clay. A bell that rang at dawn and dusk. But inside those humble walls, a miracle was unfolding, one that would save the soul of Europe. The monks were not warriors. They did not ride into battle. But they fought a quieter war, a war against forgetting. Their weapon was ink. In scriptoria, rooms that smelled of candle wax and dust, monks hunched over wooden desks, copying manuscripts for hours, sometimes days, without pause. Bent backs, sore hands, watery eyes, parchment scraped and smoothed again and again. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. But it was sacred. They copied scripture, yes, but also medicine, grammar, astronomy, old Roman law codes, herbal remedies, sometimes even pagan poetry. They didn't always understand what they were copying, but they knew it mattered. Because the past was vanishing, and they were the only ones left holding the thread. In one Irish monastery, high on a cliff battered by sea wind, a scribe paused his work to scrawl a line at the bottom of a page. The snow is very deep. I am cold, but I write still. That line survived 1,000 winters. His name did not. Elsewhere, in Northumbria, the Lindisfarne Gospels came to life, rich with color, gold leaf, swirling designs that seemed to pulse with divine rhythm. It wasn't just a book. It was a world in itself, created in silence, by candlelight, with care so precise it almost defies belief. And in Italy, monks at Monte Cassino reassembled fragments of the Roman world, drawing from whatever they could find. Broken texts, half-legible scrolls, rumors of Galen and Cicero. They pieced together civilization like archaeologists with no guide. Just instinct. And faith. But these were not safe havens. Monasteries were often targets. Raiders knew where wealth was stored: books, relics, golden chalices. Vikings sailed up rivers to plunder them. Fires swept through libraries. Entire collections disappeared in hours. And yet, over and over, the monks began again. Because memory, they believed, belonged to God. And yet, in time, something else began to happen. These centers of memory became centers of power. By the 9th and 10th centuries, monasteries weren't just humble outposts. They had grown into networks. Connected by script, by trade, by influence. Some had land, wealth, even political sway. Kings sought their blessing. Nobles sent sons to be educated behind their walls. And education meant more than prayer. It meant Latin, mathematics, philosophy. It meant reading Virgil and Augustine. It meant preserving what little light remained from the old world, and fanning it into flame. There were rules, of course. The rule of Saint Benedict, written centuries earlier, laid down the rhythm of monastic life. Prayer, work, silence, reading. Days marked by bells and scripture. But within those boundaries, thought was allowed to breathe. In the stillness of cloisters, ideas flickered. Was the earth round or flat? What moved the stars? Could one love both Plato and Christ? These weren't questions posed by kings or soldiers. They were whispered among shelves of parchment, and sometimes answered. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing was not the knowledge itself. It was the humility. Many monks never signed their names. They saw themselves as vessels, carriers. Their role was not to invent, but to preserve. To pass the torch, unseen, from one trembling hand to the next. And still, their humanity showed. In the margins of ancient manuscripts, scribes doodled cats chasing mice. Wrote notes about bad dinners. Complained about aching fingers. One wrote simply, "Thank God it is finished." Centuries later, those notes tell us more than entire chronicles. They remind us that history isn't just made by kings. It's made by tired men in cold rooms who believed the past deserved to be remembered. That belief, that quiet, stubborn devotion, is what saved Europe from silence. Because had the monasteries not preserved what they did, the Renaissance could never have happened. The thinkers of Florence and Paris would have had no scrolls to read, no ancient voices to awaken. So when we speak of the Dark Ages, we often miss the light. Not the blinding light of empire, but the gentle, flickering one, tended by monks in distant hills, cradled in silence, passed on, line by line, in a language few spoke, but all would one day need. The empire that refused to fall. Far to the east, beyond the Alps, past the collapsing villas of the Western world, there stood a city that never stopped shining. Its streets were paved in memory, its churches whispered with gold, and its people still called themselves Romans, long after the rest of the world had given that name up like a broken crown. They called their city Constantinople. And for 1,000 years after Rome fell, they kept the flame of empire burning. We rarely speak of the Eastern Roman Empire in schoolbooks. The term, Byzantine, was given to it centuries later by Western scholars who wanted to draw a clean line between Old Rome and their own Europe. But the people of Constantinople never stopped being Roman, not in title, not in law, not in spirit. And they never saw themselves as living in a dark age. From their glittering capital, ringed with mighty walls, crowned with domes and towers, they ruled with books and blades, with diplomacy and divine right. Their emperors wore purple, a color so rare and costly it was reserved for rulers and gods. Their libraries brimmed with works that the West had long since forgotten: Plato, Hippocrates, Archimedes, and thousands more. Even when the rest of Europe was rebuilding from ash and soil, Constantinople had streetlights, underground cisterns, and hospitals where the sick were treated with techniques that wouldn't return to the West for centuries. And still, we ignored them. Why? Because their story didn't fit the myth. The myth that civilization had fallen and needed to be reborn. The myth of a singular, divine rescue from the clutches of darkness. But Constantinople never fell. Not in spirit. Not in knowledge. When Latin faded, they spoke Greek. When invaders pressed at the gates, they fought back with a weapon so secret, its formula is lost even now: Greek fire, a liquid blaze that could burn on water, terrifying enemies across the Mediterranean. And yet, within those walls, there was art, music, and law. There were scholars who debated the movement of planets, and mosaics that seemed to shimmer with eternity. The Hagia Sophia, built in the 6th century, rose like a dream, its dome floating above worshippers as if held up by heaven itself. Even today, its scale stuns the senses. While Europe stumbled, Constantinople stood tall. Their courts were intricate, their laws precise, their diplomacy masterful. They negotiated with Persians, Arabs, and Franks. They bribed when they couldn't fight. They married into rival houses, trading bloodlines like gold. It was a game of centuries. And they played it well. But time is a strange storyteller. By the time Western Europe rose again in the Middle Ages, it needed a clean beginning. It wanted to be the heir of Rome, not its cousin. So Constantinople was rewritten, not as the preserver of civilization, but as something distant, alien, complicated, even corrupt. That's what the word Byzantine came to mean: twisted, obscure, decadent. But it was never that simple. Because without Constantinople, there would be no Renaissance. Their scholars fled west after the Fourth Crusade sacked their city in 1204, and again in 1453 when the Ottomans finally breached their mighty walls. They carried books under their arms, old, precious texts written in the language of Socrates and Homer. Those books lit the minds of men like Petrarch, Leonardo, and Erasmus. The Renaissance wasn't a spontaneous rebirth. It was a passing of the torch. From the east to the west. From a city the world had been taught to forget. And even after Constantinople fell, its legacy did not. In Russia, the Tsars saw themselves as inheritors of the Roman crown, calling Moscow the Third Rome. In the East, Orthodox Christianity continued to grow, tracing its lineage back to the great church by the Bosphorus. In law, in architecture, in theology, the fingerprints of Byzantium are still everywhere. So why don't we speak of them? Because their story is inconvenient. It proves that the light never truly went out. That there was no need for a resurrection, because the body had never died. It had simply moved eastward, and it had endured. While myths were written in smoky halls, and schoolbooks repeated the tale of fall and rebirth, the Eastern Roman Empire stood like a defiant candle in the wind, tall, flickering, but alive. Until the last moment. Until the last gate. Until the last prayer echoed in a church lit by golden glass, and the last emperor vanished into legend, his name carved in stone but lost in the tides of conquest. But they were never forgotten. Not by history. Not by truth. Only by us. The day the light shifted west. The light doesn't always vanish. Sometimes, it moves. And in the centuries after the fall of Rome, after the silence settled over crumbled marble and broken aqueducts, the light began to shift, slowly, steadily, toward the cold and misty edges of the Western world. To a place no one expected. Ireland. At the time, it was considered the edge of everything. A land of bogs and winds, of wild seas and even wilder myths. The Romans had never conquered it. It had no grand cities, no theaters, no aqueducts. And yet, when the rest of Europe seemed to forget how to remember, Ireland began to remember everything. They called them Insulae Doctorum, the islands of the learned. In tiny monastic settlements made of stone and wood, Irish monks copied texts the rest of the world had abandoned. They translated scripture, yes, but also preserved Roman poetry, classical philosophy, and fragments of lost science. Their work wasn't quiet. It was luminous. Look at the Book of Kells, still preserved today. Its pages shimmer with color, with designs so intricate you could lose yourself for hours tracing a single letter. The words of the Gospels are there, but beneath them is a language older, stranger. A kind of sacred code carved in ink. These weren't just religious texts. They were acts of devotion, pages filled with eternity. And the Irish didn't keep their knowledge to themselves. They carried it across Europe. Monks set sail in coracles, small, round boats, made of leather and wood, with nothing but a cross and a satchel of books. They landed in what is now Scotland, England, France, Germany. They built monasteries, taught the local people, and rekindled the spark of literacy. They weren't colonizers. They were gardeners. And what they planted would grow. Soon, their influence reached deep into the heart of Europe. Irish monks helped establish monasteries that became centers of learning. They taught local scribes how to read, how to write, how to listen for echoes of the old world in the crumbling remains around them. And they weren't alone. In the forests of Gaul, Frankish kings began to see the value in this strange light. They offered land to monasteries, encouraged the building of libraries. One ruler, Charlemagne, made it his mission to revive learning. He couldn't read or write himself, not fully. But he understood power. And he knew that memory was power. He invited scholars from across the continent to his court at Aachen. One of them, Alcuin of York, an English monk trained in the Irish tradition, helped create a standardized form of Latin writing, Carolingian minuscule. A script so clear and elegant it became the foundation of modern handwriting. Through these efforts, texts long buried were copied again. The works of Cicero, of Virgil, of Aristotle. Some for the first time in centuries. It was like the faint outline of a forgotten world slowly redrawing itself. But even then, this was not a renaissance. Not yet. It was something quieter. A whisper before the song. A glimmer before the dawn. Because across the hills and valleys of early medieval Europe, most people still lived close to the earth. They were farmers, herders, woodcutters. They didn't know Aristotle. They didn't quote Cicero. But they lived in a world being shaped, piece by piece, by the return of written thought. Suddenly, law codes were written down again. Royal decrees. Property rights. Births and deaths were recorded in churches. Calendars grew more precise. And slowly, people began to feel time again, not just in seasons, but in history. Because to write is to remember. And to remember is to believe you belong to something bigger. This wasn't a rediscovery of greatness. It was the quiet realization that greatness had never left. It had just taken root in unexpected soil, underneath the moss-covered stones of Ireland, inside the cloisters of Old Gaul, within the minds of scribes who didn't seek fame, only faith. And still, the myth would later be written, the myth of total darkness followed by a sudden explosion of light. But in truth, the light had already returned. It just hadn't shouted. It had whispered. Through quills and candles. Through waves and wind. Through men and women who believed that memory was not a luxury, but a sacred duty. So tonight, when you think of Europe in those early centuries, don't imagine silence. Imagine a candle in a small stone room, far from any city, where a monk with frost on his breath dips a feather into ink and begins to write. Not knowing who will read it, only knowing that someone must. The women history tried to erase. When we picture the so-called Dark Ages, we see monks, kings, and warriors. We see stone walls, iron swords, and hooded scribes. But one thing we rarely see is women. Not because they weren't there, but because someone made the decision to forget them. And yet, if you look closely, between the lines of surviving manuscripts, behind the icons in old chapels, beneath the whispers in village stories, you'll find them. They were healers. They were scholars. They were leaders. And they were powerful in ways that history later tried to unwrite. Take Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, for example. A 10th century canoness in what is now Germany. She wrote plays. Not just dry sermons, but full dramatic works, in Latin, inspired by Roman literature. While most of Europe struggled to preserve ancient texts, she was composing new ones, giving voice to Christian heroines, defying male playwrights who mocked women's strength. Her name should be as known as any philosopher or poet. And yet, for centuries, she was footnoted. Forgotten. Then there were the nuns, not cloistered in silence, but active in the preservation of knowledge. In convents across Europe, women copied manuscripts with the same devotion as their male counterparts. Some ran entire scriptoria. Others trained girls in reading, writing, and medicine. In the Abbey of Whitby, a woman named Hilda presided over one of the most important religious synods in Anglo-Saxon England. Kings sought her counsel. Poets revered her. And yet, her story was folded into the fabric of church history as if she were merely a footnote to male saints. And what of medicine? For generations, the healing of bodies belonged to women. In forest clearings, cottages, and cloisters, women kept the knowledge of plants, roots, and remedies. They understood fevers. They assisted births. They stitched wounds. They passed this knowledge through word, through ritual, through experience. But over time, that knowledge was labeled dangerous. The same hands that healed were called witches. Not because they changed, but because the world around them did. As universities emerged in the later medieval centuries, largely closed to women, official medicine became the domain of men. The folk healers were pushed into shadows. Their knowledge wasn't disproven. It was displaced. The forgetting wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was subtle, quiet. Imagine a scribe copying a text. He sees a woman's name and replaces it with anonymous, or skips the section entirely, or notes that her work must have been edited by a man. And just like that, a life vanishes. But some traces refuse to die. Archaeologists today uncover burial sites from the early medieval world that tell a different story. Women buried with tools of craftsmanship, keys to estates, and even military gear. In Scandinavia, one grave long believed to be a male warrior, based on the weapons within, was revealed, through DNA analysis, to be a woman. She had commanded men, and been buried with honor. History had assumed her gender, because the truth didn't fit the myth. But even more quietly, women shaped the spirit of the age. In lullabies sung to children beneath thatched roofs. In the rhythms of spinning wheels and looms, where oral stories were passed down like thread. In small churches where women lit candles, kept time, tended graves, and prayed not just for souls, but for survival. Their labor was invisible, but foundational. Without them, there is no story. And so, the narrative of the Dark Ages as a masculine domain, of sword and pen, king and monk, is only half a story. The other half is woven in silence, in patience, in courage that left no inscription but shaped the centuries all the same. There is power in quiet. Power in names that survive only through fragments, initials, or praise buried in letters. And there is justice in remembering them. Not as symbols, not as martyrs, but as people who lived, worked, loved, taught, healed, ruled, and were slowly erased. But now, the dust is clearing, and the women of the so-called Dark Ages are stepping back into the light. Not as shadows, but as sparks. The lost cities beneath our feet. If you stand quietly in the fields of Europe, you might hear it. A rhythm beneath the earth. A hush beneath the grass. The echo of footsteps on streets no longer there. Because not all cities die with fire. Some simply vanish. Across the forgotten landscape of the so-called Dark Ages, there are places where once thriving towns sank into the soil, where marketplaces crumbled and were replaced by pasture, where great stone walls were taken apart, stone by stone, to build the churches and cottages of those who came after. We rarely speak of them. But the early medieval world was filled with ruins. Not poetic, vine-covered Roman ruins, but recent, half-collapsed cities that still smelled of smoke and dust. Children played where senators once debated. Goats grazed in bathhouses. Marble columns were used as troughs or grave markers. And slowly, the names of these cities disappeared. Take Silchester, in southern Britain. Once a bustling Roman town with a forum, amphitheater, and temples, it was abandoned. Not destroyed. Not conquered. Just left. Its walls remained for centuries, silent and defiant. No new town was built in its place. The fields reclaimed it. Or Timgad, in North Africa, laid out in perfect Roman symmetry, streets still carved with cartwheel grooves. Once the pride of empire, it vanished beneath Sahara sands, so completely that it was called a ghost city until it was unearthed again in modern times. Or even Verulamium, Trier, Lutetia, cities that either shrank into villages or were reborn under new names, their past sealed beneath layers of time. Why did they fade? Some fell to invasion, some to plague, others simply because the structures of empire, its roads, its trade, its administration, had collapsed. Without that glue, cities no longer made sense. People moved to the countryside, to rivers and forests, to monasteries, to hills where defense was easier. And the cities, so carefully planned, so proudly built, became open-air quarries. To build a church in the 7th century, you took stone from the Roman baths. To craft a tomb, you reused a Roman inscription. The bones of the old world were carved into the skeleton of the new. And yet, not all was lost. Some cities never stopped breathing. Ravenna continued to shine with Byzantine mosaics. Naples retained echoes of ancient Greek streets. Constantinople, of course, never stopped. And in the Islamic world, cities like Baghdad and Cordoba rose with libraries, hospitals, and gardens that rivaled anything Rome had ever built. But in the West, there was a forgetting, not just of how to build cities, but of what cities meant. The Romans had cities for administration, for commerce, for control. But early medieval people wanted sanctuary, simplicity, space. Cities no longer meant power. They meant danger, places where plague spread faster, where enemies could corner you, where the bones of the dead lay too close to the skin of the living. And so, people turned inward. Villages, manors, hill forts. The idea of urban life, of sewage systems, forums, street grids, became a kind of legend. A story told in the shadows of broken walls. Until, slowly, the cities began to return. Not overnight, but brick by brick. When kings grew stronger, they rebuilt walls. When bishops grew richer, they raised cathedrals. When trade returned, so did streets. Paris, London, Cologne, Milan. They rose again, not as Roman cities, but as something new. Gothic, vertical, alive with bells and markets and cathedrals that reached toward heaven as if to say, "We remember." But beneath those cities, the old ones still sleep. Dig down, and you'll find layers. Coins, tiles, foundations. A doorway that led nowhere. A well filled in 1,000 years ago. Beneath a church in York, archaeologists found the floor of a Roman basilica. Beneath the streets of Cologne, a library with thousands of scrolls still waiting to be read. The past didn't disappear. It was paved over. And in that act, stone over stone, name over name, the myth of the Dark Ages was laid. Because when you walk through a modern city and feel nothing of what came before, It's easy to believe there was nothing there. But the ground remembers. And it's only a matter of time before the silence speaks. The science that slipped through the cracks. They say the Dark Ages had no science. But that isn't true. It just had a different kind of science. One whispered in candlelit cloisters, carved into ivory discs, mixed into potions, and hidden in the stars. It didn't wear the white robes of a modern lab. It wore ink-stained hands and the silence of a monk's breath over parchment. It wore the smock of an herbalist kneeling in a garden at sunrise, whispering the names of plants passed down not in textbooks, but in song. And even as Europe forgot the grandeur of Roman engineering or the precise mathematics of ancient Greece, threads of knowledge continued to flow, quiet, delicate, fragile, but unbroken. In the Islamic world, science never stopped. From the 8th to the 11th century, cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba became beacons of learning. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad wasn't just a library, it was a sanctuary for the mind. Translators worked tirelessly, converting Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. Astronomers charted the heavens. Physicians compiled vast medical encyclopedias. Mathematicians introduced algebra. Chemists experimented with distillation and metallurgy centuries before these ideas reappeared in Europe. And it didn't end there. This knowledge traveled westward, through Spain, Sicily, the Crusades, and trade routes that snaked across sand and sea. But in Europe, it arrived like a whisper. Not in triumph, but in fragments. A monk in Italy might receive a translated text on stars, copied from Arabic, which had itself been copied from Greek, which had once come from Babylon. By the time it reached his hands, it was filled with marginal notes in 3 languages, worn edges, and passages whose meanings were half a puzzle. But it was enough. The chain had not broken. It had simply frayed. And so, science in the so-called Dark Ages didn't look like progress. It looked like remembering. Medieval scholars like Isidore of Seville compiled ancient knowledge into encyclopedias. He wasn't discovering new things. He was gathering what remained, like a man picking up shattered glass and trying to make a window. In Anglo-Saxon England, the Venerable Bede studied the motion of the moon and stars. He wrote histories, computed calendars, and helped establish the very rhythm of Christian time. He lived in a monastery, never traveled far, and yet his mind stretched across the centuries. And beyond the great minds, there were the anonymous ones. Midwives who knew which herbs stopped bleeding. Blacksmiths who understood the behavior of metals by touch alone. Sailors who read stars with no need for compasses. Farmers who planted according to the rhythms of the sun and moon. Their science was not recorded in books. But it was real. It was tested every day by hunger, illness, weather, and survival. And it worked. Sometimes, this quiet science brushed against magic. Not because people were foolish, but because the world had no clear boundaries yet. Astrology and astronomy shared a name. Alchemy and chemistry danced side by side. A charm might be recited with a prayer. A healing salve might be mixed by a nun and blessed by a priest. The line between sacred and scientific was not yet drawn. And maybe that wasn't a flaw. Maybe the real loss came later, when mystery and knowledge were torn apart. When to believe meant to stop asking. When science became a cold, distant thing, and wonder was pushed into the realm of fairy tales. Because in the early medieval world, science wasn't just curiosity, it was survival. It was faith. It was hope. It was a belief that the world could still be understood. Even if only in pieces. Even if only for a moment. And so, when we look back and scoff at the people of this age, as if they feared eclipses, thought the earth was flat, and never looked past their village walls, we are mocking a shadow that was never real. The truth is gentler, stranger, more human. The truth is that they remembered what they could, preserved what they were allowed, and passed it forward, not as scholars or geniuses, but as keepers of the fire. So if you look closely enough at a medieval manuscript, in a dusty corner of a forgotten library, you might find a strange diagram. A wheel of stars. A chart of humors. A coded list of plants. Not superstition. Not ignorance. But a hand reaching across time, telling you the world still made sense. Even in the dark. The faith that built the bones of Europe. They didn't call it the Dark Ages. They called it life. And for those who lived between the ruins of Rome and the rise of cathedrals, faith wasn't just a belief. It was the air they breathed. The rhythm of the hours. The logic of the stars. The reason crops grew, kings ruled, and children were born. We imagine the medieval world as drenched in superstition, obsessed with demons and sin, terrified of damnation. But that's only the shadow. The truth is quieter, more tender. Faith wasn't always fire and brimstone. Sometimes it was a monk's hymn echoing in stone halls at dawn. Sometimes it was a worn wooden cross above a child's bed. Sometimes it was a village gathering in the frost of morning, bells ringing across a sleeping field. Christianity in the early Middle Ages wasn't yet a towering institution. It was still learning how to be European, still fusing with old traditions, local customs, and pagan memories that refused to die. And so, a strange harmony formed. Saints walked alongside spirits of the forest. Sacred wells were still visited with offerings. Church altars stood on the bones of older gods. Conversion didn't always come with violence. More often, it came with stories. Missionaries traveled not as conquerors, but as storytellers. They sat by fires in longhouses. They spoke of miracles and light and eternal life. And slowly, old gods became saints. Old festivals took on new meanings. A harvest ritual became a holy day. A sun symbol became a cross. This was not erasure. It was transformation. In Ireland, Christianity grew not by burning books, but by preserving them. Monasteries became places where the old and new danced together. Roman scripture written in Celtic script, Latin prayers filled with native rhythm. And in the Alps, in Gaul, in the forests of Germania, simple wooden churches rose like whispers, built from the land blessed with song. Inside these spaces, time itself was reshaped. The week became sacred. The year turned around feast days. The day was divided by bells, matins, lauds, vespers, compline. Time no longer belonged to the sun alone. It belonged to the soul. And so, even peasants who never held a book learned the rhythm of sacred time. Faith gave shape to their world. It told them who they were, why they suffered, where they were going. It explained death. It gave meaning to hunger. It placed every storm, every victory, every failed crop within a story larger than themselves. To us, that might feel like blindness. But to them, it was light. A kind of compass, when maps had faded. And as this faith grew, so did its bones. Stone by stone, churches rose taller. Chapels became abbeys. Shrines became cathedrals. The architecture of belief became the spine of Europe. And inside those walls, art flourished. Not for glory, not for wealth, but for devotion. Artists carved saints into lintels and painted angels in oils they mixed with ash and egg. They stained glass not just for beauty, but to teach the illiterate the stories they couldn't read. Every arch, every icon, every flickering candle held a message. You are not alone. Your life matters. Your suffering is seen. There is a pattern to the pain. And as centuries passed, the faith hardened into institution, into doctrine, into power. But at its root, in those early, forgotten centuries, faith was softer. It lived in ordinary hands, in bread divided at a wooden table, in prayers whispered before sleep, in hope that, even in the darkest of winters, spring would return. So the idea that these centuries were empty of meaning, spiritless, godless, directionless, is a myth born of arrogance. Because while kings killed and borders shifted and empires crumbled, millions of ordinary people looked upward. And in that upward gaze, they built a civilization. The myths that carried the memory. When history slips through your fingers, you don't always write it down. Sometimes you sing it. Sometimes you whisper it by firelight. Sometimes you carve it into stone. And sometimes, when the world no longer remembers how things truly were, you tell a story. A story that isn't fact, but holds a truth far older than fact. That's how memory survived the so-called Dark Ages. Not in textbooks or universities, but in legends, in sagas, in myth. While cities crumbled and kings rose and fell, people told tales. Of beasts in the forest. Of heroes who returned from the dead. Of swords that chose their master. Of a sleeping king beneath the hills who would rise when the land needed him most. We often dismiss these stories as fantasy, as the inventions of simple people lost in superstition. But we forget what myth really is. It's not a lie. It's a lantern. It's a way of remembering what matters when the world forgets everything else. In the early medieval world, myths did not distract from reality. They explained it. They gave shape to the chaos. They made sense of suffering. They held together communities with shared purpose and identity. In the sagas of the Norse, we see a world constantly edging toward doom, Ragnarok always just over the horizon. And yet, even in the face of inevitable destruction, the heroes fight on. Because courage was the point. Not victory, but defiance. It was a lesson told again and again in frozen halls. Stand, even when you cannot win. In Celtic myth, the land itself breathes. Rivers speak. Stones sing. Warriors travel between worlds, guided by dreams and omens. These weren't just stories. They were memory of older religions, of pre-Roman worlds, of a time when nature and spirit were one. In Germanic lore, forests are alive with danger and wisdom. Wotan, the god who gives up an eye for knowledge, walks disguised among mortals. Justice is earned through sacrifice. Destiny is not to be escaped, but honored. And then there is Arthur, a king who may never have lived, or who lived in 10 pieces across 10 men in 10 centuries, but whose story, stitched from both Roman ruins and Celtic longing, became the heartbeat of Britain. Camelot, the Round Table, Excalibur. These weren't just romantic fantasies. They were an attempt to remember, to rebuild a vanished order, to believe that justice could return, that a golden age had once existed and might come again. Because when people lose history, they create legend. And legend does something history often cannot. It moves the heart. A farmer in the 8th century might never have read Tacitus or heard the name Charlemagne, but he knew the tale of Beowulf. A bard in a village might not understand Latin, but she could sing of heroes whose blood mixed with the gods. A child might never see a city, but he'd grow up knowing that dragons could be slain, that evil could be outwitted, and that every forest held a secret path. This is how culture survives when records burn. Through memory shaped like story. Through truth told with the wings of imagination. And it wasn't just pagans who told these tales. The church understood the power of narrative. Saints' lives became modern epics, miracles, visions, martyrdoms. Some were based in fact. Others were wrapped in wonder. But all of them taught lessons. About grace. About sacrifice. About divine order in a broken world. In this way, myth and memory weren't opposites. They were twins. They carried the weight of the past across generations who had no other way to know it. So when we call these centuries dark, we miss the point. Because while historians argue over what was lost, people of the time found ways to hold on. Not through science alone. Not through law or architecture or empire. But through story. A story told to a child at night, when the wind howled through the thatch and wolves howled beyond the trees. A story that said, we come from something. We belong to something. We remember. And sometimes, that's enough. the lives we forgot to remember. History loves its empires, its kings, its swords and saints and battles carved into stone. But most people who lived through the centuries we call dark weren't kings. They weren't monks. They weren't even names in any book. They were farmers, mothers, weavers, woodcutters, children who grew up never leaving the valley they were born in. They didn't write the chronicles, but they carried the world. And without them, there would have been nothing to remember. Imagine waking at dawn in a thatched cottage. No clock, no alarm, just the rhythm of light and bird song. You sleep beside the fire for warmth, wrapped in wool, the smoke curling upward through a hole in the roof. Your world is simple, but not empty. You know the sky, the soil, the call of animals. You know which herbs soothe the sick, which berries to avoid, when to plant, when to pray for rain. You measure time not in minutes but in chores, in bread rising, in cows lowing, in the sound of church bells echoing from a nearby hill. You've never seen a city, never read a word, but you know the seasons better than any calendar. And still, we imagine these people as lost in ignorance. Because they didn't write books? Because they didn't build marble monuments? But they built something more important: continuity. The thread that binds civilization from one century to the next. They passed on language. They taught children how to live. They kept customs alive in the cracks where history refused to look. Even their beliefs, part pagan, part Christian, were living fossils. Rituals that held memories far older than Rome. A blessing spoken before a hunt. A charm sewn into clothing. A candle lit for both saints and spirits. They weren't confused. They were layered. In their eyes, the world was full of mystery, but not chaos. Every illness had meaning. Every birth was sacred. Every grave was a doorway. And even if they didn't understand the stars, they still looked up, night after night, and wondered. In many ways, they lived more closely to the world than we do. They touched what they ate. They knew the pain of hunger. They felt the weather not as inconvenience, but as life and death. We have mistaken technology for intelligence. But they knew things we have forgotten. How to make fire without matches. How to live without light. How to hear the sky in the silence. And yet, their stories were rarely told. When we think of the Middle Ages, we picture lords in armor and popes in golden robes. But behind every crown was 100 hands sewing, digging, tending, praying. In old graveyards across Europe, you can still find their markers. Rough stones. No inscriptions. Just a cross. Or sometimes nothing at all. But their presence remains. In the language we still speak. In the roads we still walk. In the bread we still bake. They were the heartbeat beneath the noise of kings and wars. And when we say, Dark Ages, we bury them again. Because they weren't dark. They were just quiet. So the next time you imagine the Middle Ages, don't start with castles. Start with a woman stirring a pot in a cold hut. A man mending a fence before the frost. A child holding a carved toy made by hands no one will remember. That's where history lives. Not in glory, but in the quiet work of survival. When the world began to wake. There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when a forest, long frozen in winter, begins to thaw. You don't see it at first. You hear it. A drip. A creak of branch. A bird, returning before the others. That's how it was in the final centuries of what we call the Dark Ages. The world began to wake. Not with trumpets. Not with fireworks. But with footsteps. Wagons. Markets. Letters. Trade routes, long dead, were reborn. Across the Alps, merchants began moving again. Salt from the mountains. Cloth from Flanders. Wine from France. Spices from the east. Little by little, the roads that had been choked by silence filled once more with voices, haggling, wheels creaking, hooves pounding dust into air. And the cities, they returned. Not as copies of Rome. Not in marble and columns. But in timber and stone, with crooked streets and smoky hearths and bells that rang the hours once more. Paris. London. Cologne. Venice. They swelled with new life, not because of conquest, but because of connection. A shoemaker from one town could now sell to another. A monk from Ireland could walk to Rome. A cloth dyer in the Low Countries could trade with a merchant in Constantinople, whose wares came from Persia, whose dyes came from India. And so, slowly, Europe's heartbeat quickened. Universities appeared, not all at once, but like sparks, Bologna, Oxford, Paris. Places where men gathered to ask questions older than cathedrals. What is a soul? What is truth? What lies beyond the stars? The answers were not always clear. But the asking mattered. Books began to move too. Manuscripts once locked in monasteries were copied, carried, studied, debated. The knowledge preserved by Muslim scholars, Jewish thinkers, Byzantine librarians, and generations of anonymous monks was now breathing again in the halls of the West. And with it, new knowledge arrived. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy. The West wasn't rediscovering the ancient world. It was finally catching up to the rest of it. And as the roads widened, so did the mind. People traveled more. Pilgrims, traders, knights, wanderers. With every step, they carried more than goods. They carried ideas. In Italy, cities like Florence and Genoa began to thrive on trade and banking, not conquest. In Spain, cultures mixed, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in fire. Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, woven together like threads of an ancient tapestry. It wasn't perfect. There was still war, still ignorance, still hunger and injustice. But something was changing. You could feel it in the architecture, arches reaching higher, windows growing larger, light pouring into stone chapels that once huddled in darkness. You could hear it in the music, no longer just chants, but layers of harmony, the early heartbeat of polyphony. You could see it in the faces of painters, carving humanity into icons, reaching not just for the divine, but for the human soul behind the eyes. This wasn't a sudden renaissance. It was the slow exhale after a long, hard breath. A world remembering how to dream again. And perhaps, this is the great misunderstanding of the Dark Ages, that there was a moment when light simply returned. But light never left. It flickered in hidden corners. It smoldered beneath ash. And when the world was ready, it caught flame again, not as a miracle, but as a memory reawakened. A farmer's daughter who could now read. A blacksmith who signed his name. A student who asked questions once thought too dangerous to ask. The world hadn't been dead. It had been sleeping. And now, it was opening its eyes. The invention of the Dark Ages. It didn't start with a lie. It started with a story. A story whispered in salons, painted in oil, written in polished Latin by men who believed they were waking from a long and troubled dream. They called it Renaissance, rebirth. And to be reborn, something must have died. So they looked back at the centuries before them, centuries of wood and wool, of candles and cloisters, of saints and scribes, and they declared them dark. Not dim, not different, dark. The words slipped easily into speech. 1,000 years of silence. 1,000 years of ignorance. 1,000 years of superstition, disease, and dirt. It was a convenient myth. Because if you wished to appear brilliant, first dim the light around you. And the Renaissance did exactly that. Its thinkers idolized Greece and Rome. Marble, symmetry, mathematics, human anatomy rendered in perfect form. They saw themselves as heirs to the classical world, and saw everything between as a shadow. But they didn't see what was really there. the flickers of memory preserved by monks, the knowledge passed through Muslim libraries, the cities that rose again, brick by brick, while the paint dried on their frescoes. They didn't see the shoulders they stood on, because they needed a contrast. So the Middle Ages became a canvas, not for truth, but for myth. And that myth stuck. Later generations, especially in the Enlightenment, sharpened it further. Medieval became an insult. Feudal, barbaric, primitive. It became a way to mock faith, to reject monarchy, to frame progress as inevitable. And eventually, we stopped questioning it. We taught children that history leapt from Rome to the Renaissance with nothing but plague and darkness in between. We made films that showed filth and fear. We laughed at peasants. We romanticized kings. We erased the rest. We turned over 1,000 years of memory into a footnote. But memory is stubborn. Today, archaeologists uncover roads and workshops and tools more advanced than we imagined. Linguists trace poetry through centuries of oral tradition. Historians reread manuscripts once dismissed and find complex ideas, subtle arguments, deep minds at work. The more we dig, the more light we find. And so we ask, why was this story buried? Perhaps because it's easier to worship progress than to question its path. Easier to declare ourselves modern by declaring others backward. Easier to draw a line through history and say, here is where it began. But there was no line. History is not a ladder. It's a tapestry. Woven from forgotten hands, strange detours, quiet moments that shaped everything we know. The so-called Dark Ages were not empty. They were alive. With memory. With struggle. With the stubborn glow of people who believed that life had meaning, even in the cold, even in the mud, even when no one would ever remember their name. And now, centuries later, we remember. Not just to correct the record, but to honor the truth. That history does not belong to the victors. It belongs to the forgotten. The light was always there. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. The breath of wind over stone ruins. The hush of parchment turning beneath candlelight. The quiet murmur of names that history tried to forget. The Dark Ages were never truly dark. They were dimmed, by distance, by assumption, by the blinding glow of those who came later and needed contrast to claim brilliance. But in the shadows, life never stopped moving. It pulsed softly, like coals beneath ash. This was not a time without meaning. It was a time of transformation. When the pieces of a fallen empire scattered, and new stories began to form in the soil. When faith shaped time, and time shaped faith. When people planted seeds they would never live to see bloom. And for 1,000 years, those seeds took root. In the whispered lessons of monks who preserved ancient texts without fame or reward. In the psalms of travelers who carried languages across continents. In the hands of midwives, blacksmiths, scribes, farmers, who each, in their own quiet way, kept the world alive. We often think history moves in grand gestures, conquests, discoveries, declarations. But more often, it moves in stillness, in the choice to remember, to rebuild, to believe that the future was worth tending. And when the world began to brighten again, when cities grew, and books multiplied, and artists painted with light, we called it a new beginning. But it was never new. It was the continuation of a story told in darkness. So why call it a cover-up? Because for centuries, we let the myth win. We let 1,000 years be reduced to a blank space between golden eras. We let the lives of millions be brushed away with the word dark. But the truth was always there, waiting beneath the dust, inscribed in stone, sewn into tapestries, buried in the bones of ancient cities and the margins of forgotten manuscripts. And now, we're learning to see again. To look at the past not as a straight line, but as a great web, interwoven, fragile, and impossibly rich. So perhaps it's time to stop asking why they were called the Dark Ages. And start asking why we were so eager to believe it. Because in the end, History isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember, what we choose to pass on, what we choose to illuminate. And when we light a candle in the past, we don't just reveal them, we reveal ourselves.